So thank you very much for inviting me here today. I might speak for about 15 minutes time-wise and then maybe 10 minutes for questions. How's that for time? Or less? I can do shorter. I've given the shortest speech in Parliament where I got up and said ditto once and that was it. It was very well received. So thank you very much. It was. I mean, as you're aware, that gambling is the issue that brought me into politics almost 20 years ago, and it's still the core of what I'm concerned about. Because to me, if a government gets it wrong in terms of gambling, it actually has lost its way on so many other issues. What else is it getting wrong? If it's prepared to rely so heavily on gambling taxes, when there is an enormous human cost involved in relation to that, in terms of gambling-related crime, family breakup, most tragically of all, suicide, then what else is it getting wrong? And we now have a challenge in terms of online gambling, as well as the problems we're having with poker machines. But it seems to me that the issue of poker machines is incredibly entrenched. I'm criticised for not doing enough on pokies. It's not through lack of trying, but if I'm joined by other like-minded people in the federal parliament in particular, I think we can lever more there. We can have extra resources to tackle that issue. All countries like to think of themselves as being number one in the world in relation to something, best at this or best at that. Australians have many firsts to be proud of, but there's one first that we shouldn't be proud of, and that is that we're the number one nation in the world in terms of per capita gambling losses and problem gambling. The average annual gambling loss for Australian adults in 2014 was estimated to be $1,279. That was a higher rate of loss than in every other developed country. The only country that comes close to us is Singapore, and they might overtake us, but the Singapore figures are skewed because a lot of that gambling is through international tourism. That they've got those two big casinos where they really are bringing in a lot of players from other countries. So in terms of local gambling, local losses, we're clearly number one in the world. It's more than twice the average loss in New Zealand, Canada, and the United Kingdom, nearly twice that of the United States, and of course, many people lose a lot more than the average of close to $1,300 a year. I don't gamble at all because I think it would be politically embarrassing if I won the $20 million Powerball. I'd have to seek political asylum in the Cayman Islands or some other tax haven. Problem gamblers lose around $21,000 each year. That's about a third of the average wage. But of course, for many of those problem gamblers, that's often much more than that. It can be virtually all their wages in many respects. On the Australian government's own estimates, there are in the order of 300,000 Australians who either have got a severe gambling problem or at risk of becoming one. And that is very significant. In fact, those figures are quite conservative. I've seen some figures saying those at risk and those who already have a problem that's close to 500,000. I believe in being very conservative on this, otherwise the ABC fact check unit will get to me, which I've heard, a rumour may be shut down very soon, which would be a real shame in terms of our democracy. That 300,000 figure, if you want to be conservative about it, every problem gambler affects the lives on average of 5 to 10 others, 7 people, says the Productivity Commission. So even with those conservative figures, something like 10% of the population is directly affected by problem gambling. And that's a very significant figure. It means that 2 million people affected. There's a figure given by the Productivity Commission as much as $4.7 billion a year and up to $8.4 billion a year in terms of negative costs. So every time the gambling industry says we contribute this much and that much to the economy, you need to put that in perspective, because the negative impacts include the financial disasters, the loss of jobs, the loss of homes, fraud, theft, family breakups, and mental health problems. And a psychiatrist, not the one that was a candidate for me, but Malcolm Battersby, who runs the Flinders unit in terms of their cognitive behaviour therapy, which has been very successful in a number of cases, he made the point at a forum a number of years ago, which stuck in my mind. He says, this is a case where an act of Parliament, a deliberate act of politicians through the Parliament back in 1992 rather, and they were introduced in 1994, has actually increased the level of mental health problems in the community in terms of depression, suicidal ideation and the like. Problem gamblers are 6 times more likely to be divorced than non-problem gamblers. Problem gamblers are 4 times more likely to have problems with alcohol and 4 times more likely to smoke daily than non-problem gamblers. Children with parents who are problem gamblers are up to 10 times more likely to become problem gamblers themselves than children with non-gambling parents. And only between 5 and 10% of problem gamblers seek help. Now, I'm a great believer in the adage, it's much better to have a fence at the top of the cliff rather than the best equipped ambulance at its base. But even in terms of the ambulance at its base, and you would know this in the work that you do, only between 5 to 10%, 5 to 15% of problem gamblers seek help. And even the most hardcore elements of the gambling lobby admit that if someone has a gambling problem, they should get help, but they're not being reached. There's stigma. I had a constituent many years ago who had a heroin problem, and she also had a gambling problem. She told me she was more ashamed of her gambling problem than her drug substance abuse problem because of the stigma that was associated with it. People say, you must be stupid to have a gambling problem. And as you know, people from all walks of life, all forms of education, all forms of socioeconomic background can get hurt by this. If gambling was problem gambling was a communicable disease, it would have been declared a national crisis years ago, but it's not, because state governments are really the number one jackpot junkies in this country. They rely on it so heavily. But what is more insidious, and I discovered this back in 2010, 2011, 2012, was when Andrew Wilkie held the balance of power in the lower house and we worked closely together to try and bring about reforms to gambling. The Gillard government really didn't have their heart in it. And I hate saying that, but they didn't, according to what some insiders told me. It was to get Andrew across the line. The Abbott-led opposition was completely destructive about it. And the problem is that the lobby is so incredibly powerful. It is nothing for some of these publicans, or clubs for that matter, to make a donation of $50,000 or $100,000 in a seat, which can swing the outcome. I mean, and I know that, how important money is, because we are running on not a shoestring budget, on a dental floss budget at the moment. And although I've discovered this thing called social media, Facebook, it used to be called the Facebook apparently, those you didn't know. I did get 400,000, my record number of hits, you know those election posters that went up prematurely? I held up a sign next to Christopher Bynes, who was a student of mine, by the way, nearly 30 years ago. I've taught him everything he doesn't know. I held a sign saying premature erection equals cheating, and that got 400,000 hits. So that's not bad. I mean, that's cheaper than advertising. But in terms of, I know it's the salvos, but you'll forgive me for saying that. It was just, I come in trouble now. I'm getting that look of death, that Julie Bishop look. It is a big problem because when you have powerful vested interests, they will do everything possible to avoid change because they rely on so many people being hooked. The business model, with 40% of pokies' losses from problem gamblers, their business model would be ruined if they didn't have so much money being lost by problem gamblers. And that is why this is such an important issue. We know what the problems are with poker machines. We know that governments fall over themselves to support gambling expansion. In January, Adelaide's Sky City Casino was given permission to proceed with a $300 million expansion with 1,500 new poker machines and 200 new gambling tables. Where will that money come from? It'll come from an increased level of problem gamblers. I don't think we're going to get jumbo jets loads of overseas tourists just coming to Adelaide to gamble. I think we've got better things going for us than just our gambling. If it wants to get its money back, it needs to rely on problem gamblers, and that's a real concern. So I think any government that chases gambling as a form of economic development is really chasing fool's gold. And the SA Centre for Economic Studies, Michael O'Neill, who heads that centre, does terrific work. They did a study a number of years ago that showed for every $1 million lost on poker machines, 3 jobs were created. $1 million spent on retail in your department store creates 6 jobs. $1 million spent in hospitality in your small corner stores, cafes, creates up to 18 jobs in the SA. And I'm happy to forward to you that study done by the SA Centre for Economic Studies. Pokies and gambling are a job killer, not a job creator. So every time the industry says, but we employ 20,000 people, how many more additional people would be employed if some of that money was diverted away from the billions we lose each year in gambling? Now, with online gambling, and this is something I campaigned on many years ago. I remember when Brian Harradine was in the Senate, the legendary senator from Tasmania. I was a state member of Parliament and I had to knock on doors and lobby in Canberra. I got lost in the building, and embarrassingly, I still get lost at Parliament House with its 22 kilometres of corridors. Tim Costello and I, when we were campaigning together, he actually said with internet gambling, you'll soon be able to lose your home without ever actually having to leave it. And that was something that Tim said 15 years ago that resonates as strongly today. With online gambling, you can lose 24/7. That was before the proliferation of mobile phones and using it. You can lose your salary while you're still at work. You can lose your house while you're sitting in it. And while online betting is still only a minority part of Australia's $20 billion wagering market, it's a sector that's growing exponentially. It's doing double-digit growth. The estimates a turnover of above 3 billion and possibly as much as 5 billion, we don't know. That's the legal side of it. The illegal side with those offshore casinos, we just don't know. And if you go to I don't want to give them a plug, but some of them you switch on and they have a geolocator. They'll have some, scantily clad men or women draped in the Australian flag with Aussie flags in the background. So it looks as though you're gambling locally. It looks like it's a local outfit. Incredibly misleading. And I've dealt with constituents who have lost everything with online gambling. And what occurs, invariably they're set up in Gibraltar, the Rock of Gibraltar, where you write to the gambling commissioner there and you're lucky to get a response. So they make you go through all these hoops. You don't get any response at all. So obviously we need to try and tackle the offshore casinos as well as the onshore gambling aspects. Back in 2011, I introduced a bill on online gambling, and I did it again more recently after Financial Counselling Australia produced a report. It was a landmark report released in August last year. It was headed Duds, Mugs and the A-List, the impact of uncontrolled sports betting. Have you read it? Go to Financial Counselling Australia. It's a terrific report. There's a lot of work. I work closely with them. The impetus for me to put in the bill again, a fresh bill, so it's part of the agenda to be debated, is a woman from Central Coast of New South Wales spoke to me at this conference where I spoke to it in Canberra, and she took me aside and said, do you know, in the last month, I've been dealing with the families of 2 young men that suicided from their sports betting addictions, who lost everything. And these weren't the illegal Gibraltar or Cayman Islands based sites. These were the so-called legalised, or they are legalised, the accepted sites. So that's the impact of it. You've had research by Professor Samantha Thomas in the eastern states who actually says young men actually feel peer pressure if they don't gamble. I mean, I find that staggering. So I think that's very concerning. What the bill that I introduced seeks to do, it seeks to prohibit those prohibited websites, and you can do it. You can use technology and geo-blockers, and you can also disrupt the financial transaction, which is what would kill them off. But it also seeks to ban credit inducements. You can't have credit at pokies venues. It seeks to ban sports betting advertising, which is very contentious because now TV networks that are doing it tougher are relying more and more heavily from that. And the AFL, are those cameras rolling? Good. I just want to say this. The AFL has been a disgrace in the way they have relied more and more heavily on online gambling. This is a sporting code, a wonderful sporting code, that has got over $2 billion in broadcast rights from the networks. But that's not enough for them. They are now entering into agreements with CrownBet, run by Jamie Packer, and on the board of CrownBet happens to be Andrew Demetriou, who used to be the CEO of the AFL. He's the immediate past CEO of the AFL. That link between sports betting and sporting codes is really, really unhealthy, and it makes it more difficult to shift. So this is the big challenge, because I think that's where we're going to see a big increase, and I'd like to hear from you as whether you're seeing more young men in particular who've got that problem. My job is not prohibitionist, but to actually minimise the harm. You ban the credit betting. You have adequate warnings. You don't have ball-by-ball betting, because that is one of those things where ball-by-ball betting can really foster corruption in sporting codes. Because if it's in a cricket match, you saw Shane Warne many years ago, he got paid thousands of dollars to give weather forecasts for the pitch from a bookie in India. That's the sort of thing that we need to worry about. So this needs to be an election issue, because the next tidal wave of problem gambling, I think, will come from sports betting and online. The government does the government did pick up one of the key areas of my bill, and that was to ban in-play betting. You know, the in-play betting, so you can actually bet while the game's in the middle of a race, while the game's still going. Other bookies won't do it. William Hill did it. Do you remember Tom Waterhouse? He's sold out to William Hill, but he still works for them. That really drives revenue. There's been a 65% increase in turnover for those. Interestingly, Tattersalls and Tabcorp have taken a more conservative view. They actually understand that it's actually bad for their business model for gambling addiction to skyrocket like that. So there's a big difference between Bet365. Have you guys seen the Bet365 ads? They're just extraordinary. And you have, who's that famous actor? Samuel Jackson, I think. Yeah, who's pretty big on that. So the Australian newspaper quoted at the time, when this was introduced a few weeks ago, that they're going to ban it, but they haven't introduced it yet, the legislation. By shutting this loophole and deferring a final position until after the election, the government has shielded itself from marginal seat campaigns from pubs and clubs and other opponents of in-play betting, and has also robbed anti-gambling campaigner and independent Senator Nick Xenophon of a stick to beat it with. Well, I reckon they haven't got rid of the stick. They've given me a whole forest of wood, because the fact that it's on the agenda indicates that they realise it's a problem. Why would you only do a temporary ban? Why don't you do a permanent ban, given the damage it causes to the community? I really want to say finally that I think there's a community expectation of more action, not less action. 90% of Australians wanted to see $1 bets on poker machines. You may remember Neil Lawrence, who passed away tragically in the Maldives just about a year ago. He did the Stop the Loss campaign. He was also the genius behind the Kevin 07 advertising campaign. Terrific man. And he was just absolutely passionate, donated his time on this. He did the surveys. 90% of Australians understand that $1 bets, minimising losses to $120 an hour, would make a big difference. And people wouldn't be able to lose as much, as quickly. Along with other protections, you would have much less damage caused to the community. I just wanted to also look at the issue of sports betting and corruption in sports. I think the more in-play betting you have, the more vulnerable we are to have some match-fixing event or some dodgy activities in sporting fields, and that itself could destroy the integrity of a sporting code and break the hearts of millions of fans of that code. Barry O'Farrell, the former New South Wales Premier, he did a report recently, had a number of recommendations which were okay, but advertising was excluded from that, and it just goes to show where I think the lobby is. They know if they lose advertising, that is something that will really hurt their expansion plans in relation to the sector. So this is tough. It'd be great to take your questions and your comments and your feedbacks. I want this to be an election issue. I want this to be something that people think about when they vote, and I'm not just putting in a pitch for the candidates that are running with me, but for any politician that will actually say, we will vote for $1 bets, we will vote against sports betting advertising, we'll vote against credit, we will vote to ensure that kids aren't bombarded with sports betting ads while they're watching their favourite game, whether it's AFL or league or soccer. So they're the issues. And I guess the final thing is that this is a tough battle, but I'm reminded of that line from Anita Roddick, who founded The Body Shop, who said, if you think you're too small to make a difference, try going to bed with a mosquito in your room. So hopefully there are a few mosquitoes in this room to campaign on this. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take your questions.